In this video, we're going to look at the assembly environment in Creo. For this, I've modeled these three parts, and I want to assemble them in the way shown. The guide in red is rigid. The link in yellow can rotate about the pins on the guide. And the cap in green is rigid as well. This cannot translate up and down or rotate about the guide. It is completely rigid. In order to make this, I'm going to start my assembly. I'm going to select assembly and name it. And one thing that I want to do is double check that my working directory is selected correctly. This is so that it's easy to find the parts I want to import, and it's easy to keep track of them in case I want to export them later. First thing I want to do is import my ground part, or my reference for all my future parts. Typically, your ground is not going to move. It's going to be completely rigid. In this case, my ground is my guide. Any part that you import is initially going to be purple. Also, you're going to see this 3D dragger here, and you're going to see that the color aligns with the axes. So the red arrow goes with the x-axis, and the red arc allows it to rotate about the x-axis, and the same for the Z in blue and the Y in green. If all three arrows and all three arcs are shown, then we know that we have all 6 degrees of freedom, and it can move and rotate in any direction. Now I want to select my connection type. The default is user-defined, but we want to avoid using this because anything you might want to use is going to exist in this list, and we really want to avoid those automatic constraints and make sure everything we're doing is intentional. The constraints that you're going to use the most are rigid, which will constrain your part in all 6 degrees of freedom, pin, which allows it to rotate about an axis, slider, which allows it to move along an axis. Cylinder is a combination of pin and slider, so it can rotate and move along a single axis. Planar allows it to move in 2 dimensions. It allows it to translate in 2 dimensions, but not rotate. Ball allows it to rotate about all 3 axes, but it cannot move or translate. And weld fixes the object. The rest you can explore on your own. As I said earlier, we want our ground to be rigid, so that's what I'm going to select. These connection types here, you can see in the placement tab, should satisfy all the requirements for the rigid predefined constraint. For rigid, this means constraining from translation and rotation in all directions. I'm going to start by choosing some planes to constrain. There's 2 ways that you can do this. You can select the planes directly, or I can select them in the model tree. Sometimes it's difficult when there's more parts going on, more datums in the way. Now I can see that my X arrow has disappeared, meaning that it can't translate in that direction anymore. However, it can still move up and down, forward and back, and rotate about some of these axes. Now I'm going to choose the rest of my planes that I want to constrain. So as you can see, I want my 2 front planes to be coincident. However, they're at this angle. So Creo thinks it wants to be at an angle offset. So I'm going to go to constraint type right here and change that to coincident. My last constraint is the 2 top planes. When all constraints are satisfied, the part is going to turn this orange-yellow color. This does not necessarily mean it's rigid, it just means it's fully constrained based on the connection type you selected. And I also have this little reminder right here under status that this part is fully constrained. Next, I want to add my link. In this, you can see that the link goes around each pin. So instead of creating 3 links, I'm going to create one and add this pattern. And I'm going to do it for the cap too, since that is the same as the link. What I want to make sure is that these pins were created with a pattern so that I can just reference them. And if I click my drop down here, I can see that they were. I can also see that this pin on the far left is the lead pin. So that's what I want to mate my link and my cap to before I pattern them. So I'm going to click Assemble and open my link. As I showed you earlier, these links are able to rotate, so we don't want them to be fixed. We want them to be a pin connection. So the first thing it's asking for is my axis alignment, and I want these two to be aligned. Next, it's kind of hard to see my two surfaces, so I'm going to space these out a little bit. And it's asking for my translation, so I want these two surfaces to be coincident. All of my constraints are satisfied, but you can see this arc is still here, as it's not rigid, but the connection definition is complete. Maybe I want to limit the rotation of this pin. I'm going to go to rotation axis here. And the first thing I need to do is set a 0 position. So I'm going to do that by setting the angle between these two pins to be 0 would be on this side, so I want it to be 180 so it stays on this side of the guide. And I'm going to set this to be my new 0 position. And I can add limits if I want it to stay between -45 and +45 degrees. I'm going to hit OK. And I'm going to hit drag components to double check that. To drag components, I click the feature up top. I click once on my part, and then I do not need to hold the click down. I can just move it, and you can see that it's limited by 45 degrees on either side. When I'm done with this feature, I single click again, and it stays wherever it was last. Now I want to add my cap so I can finish that pattern. As I showed you earlier, the cap is going to be rigid. So I'm going to select my rigid connection type. I can choose these two axes, and I don't want them to be at a distance. I want them to be coincident. And I want to add a new constraint between these two surfaces, which is a little difficult to see. I want that to be coincident as well. Even though my cap is in the right place, in the right position, it's not fully constrained, it's only partially constrained because it can still rotate, which I don't want it to do. I'm gonna add for my last constraint something between these two planes, a parallel connection. I'm gonna keep them normal so that it can't rotate anymore. Now I can see that it has turned this yellow-orange color, it is fully constrained, and I can hit OK. I need to move my picture to show this next part. Over here on the left, I have my link and my cap. I'm going to hold my Shift key and group these two features. And now, since these pins were made with a pattern, I'm going to click the pattern tool, and up here, reference is already selected. It is already referencing this pattern, and you can see where it will be placed. Hit OK, and there they are. Now my part is fully assembled, but it's kind of hard to see. There's a lot going on here. During the assembly process, it might be tempting to hide all of these planes so that you can see what you're working with. But as you saw earlier, we used a lot of these, so it's good to keep them visible. If there's a plane I specifically want to hide that I know I'm not going to be using, I can change it in the model tree. I can right click and hit this hide, and that plane will disappear. I can do something a little more obvious to see. This top plane here, I'm right clicking on, in hiding and it disappears. But if I want to add it back, I can just do the same thing. Since I'm done with my assembly, I'm going to hide all of these. And I want to add colors to my parts so that I can tell them apart a little easier. I'm going to select my part in the model tree, hit the drop down below Appearance in the Model tab, and I'm going to make that red. Next, I want to do it for my links as well, and I want them all to be the same color. So I'm going to click on a link, hold down my Control key, and click the rest of the links, and make those yellow. And the same for the caps. If for some reason I want a certain surface to be different than the rest of the part, which typically you don't, but for whatever reason I will show you, I can click on the surface, click on Appearance, and choose the color. There's also a lot of different options for the appearances, and there's even more under More Appearances. But I'm going to change that back to green. As I showed you earlier, we have the drag components feature, which is very useful in figuring out how your part moves and if it is correctly assembled. The next thing I want to show you is interference. I'm going to go into the Analysis tab and look at this Global Interference button. Hit OK, and down here, I can see that there are no interfering parts. You always want to check your interference, and of course there are some parts where it's okay, such as an O-ring that you know is going to have interference, you know it's going to get squished down a little bit, but it's something that you definitely want to be aware of. You definitely want to identify and be mindful of your interference. So just to show you an example, I'm going to create some interference between my parts. Go back to this Analysis tab, click on Global Interference, and now I can see that these two links are highlighted here and also in the model tree. And down here, it tells me the volume of that interference. It tells me the volume of the overlap. But I'm going to move those back so that we have no interference. The next thing I want to show you is the exploded view. So I'm going to go to View, hit the drop down below Manage Views, and look at my View Manager. You can see Default Explode here, and I can right click on it and hit Activate. If you're not seeing this, you might be in the wrong tab. Just make sure you're in the Explode tab. So Creo will create an explode for you, and typically it's not very good. We can see that some of the caps are below the links, one of them is above. These links aren't level. This is just not a very good explode. So there's a couple things we can do for this. We can right click on it and edit position, and we can move these around. Or the other thing I want to do is create a new explode, which I'm going to call my explode. And I want to edit the position. So I can select my components, and I want my caps to all be at the same level. So I'm going to hold my Control key, select all three, and move them with these arrows. And then I want my guide to move down. So I'm going to do the same for that. I can do a lot of different things. I can move them outwards, and I can separate them, but this is good for me right now. So I'm going to hit OK. And you can see that there's this plus sign next to my explode. That means that it's not saved. If I'm happy with this and I want to save it, I can right click and hit save. And that plus sign will disappear. This green arrow means that my explode is activated right now. If I activate the default explode, that arrow will move, but I'm going to keep it on my explode and hit close. And now when I hit exploded view right here, it will be my explode instead of the default. The last thing I want to show you real quick is what happens if you change a part. If I want to modify my guide, I can click on it and click on this open part button here, and it will open my part directly. If I want to make this extrude a little wider. I want to change this radius to 10 so we can really see the difference. Have that all set and saved, and I'm going to go back into my assembly. And we can see that it automatically updated. However, in the case that this doesn't happen, we can go to model and hit regenerate, and it will regenerate your part with any updates that may have been made.